This is BBC News, the headlines. President Trump says there could be some pain for Americans because of new tariffs, but insists it will be worth it. Taxes will be imposed on imports from Canada, Mexico and China. All three countries have promised countermeasures. Negotiations on the second stage of the Gaza ceasefire deal will begin this week, according to the Israeli Prime Minister's office. Qatar says there's no clear plan for the start of the talks, which are aimed at securing a permanent ceasefire. The UK government will introduce new laws to tackle the threat of child sex abuse images generated by artificial intelligence. The Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, said AI has industrialised the scale of online child abuse. The Grammys are being held in LA later. Beyoncé and Taylor Swift square off for Album of the Year. Beyoncé's Cowboy Carter has 11 nominations. The star is already the most decorated artist in Grammy history. Now on BBC News, Newscast.
Right, so we're doing an unusual show today. There's no Henry because we're going to do a scoop from two great journalists who we'll meet in a moment.
More than one scoops. Scoops a go-go, I might even say. But it's a different Sunday because we're doing that, but also because we're sitting next to each other.
We're here because
quite nice.
We're going to reveal our two guests in a moment. Have you done any acting in your life?
Badly, yeah.
Right, me too. I was Oliver, my voice broke. So
what, on stage?
Well,
while you were saying, please, can I have some more?
More. Oh. So there's a story about an actor coaching the Prime Minister, which we're going to talk about.
Yes, we will. And I have always wondered, actually, who was helping Keir Starmer behind the scenes as he made his journey from opposition leader to Prime Minister, because his communication style has changed. And now we know the identity of the person who helped him along the way.
Which we will reveal on Sunday's Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
And Laura in the studio. And in the studio we are joined by the authors of Get In, which is the new political book of the moment. It's being serialised in the Times newspaper. And it is chock-a-block with scoops. So as Paddy says, we should give you our journalistic congratulations. It's a really romping read full of stories about Keir Starmer.
We must say the name.
I was about to get them to introduce themselves.
Oh, yes. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Happily. My name is Gabriel Pogrund. I co-wrote this book with the man who will now introduce himself.
As Patrick Maguire. I work at the Times, Gabriel works at the Sunday Times, so there we are.
So we're going to talk about the scoops a go-go, as Laura calls it. But can I just go a bit meta? Get In. They had so many years of opposition, didn't they? And they finally get in. And your book says it's quite difficult. There's friction. And I'm thinking to myself, yes, it's a very difficult job to be in opposition. It's a very difficult job to be in government. I'm not surprised there's friction.
Nor are we. And I suppose we aren't making a value judgment in revealing what happened and how it happened. We are just trying to depict this historically unusual situation in which Labour has gotten into power. I think, reflect in the book that Tony Blair said that he wanted the 21st century to be a Labour century. The 20th century had been a Conservative century, and that's not really what the first 2 decades of the 21st century entailed. And Keir Starmer has defied history and dragged his party back into power, and we wanted to examine how that happened.
And it is an incredible journey. I mean, you remember the Labour leadership contest in 2019. There were some people running for the job, including Lisa Nandy, who's now, of course, in Cabinet, saying, actually, Labour might not even exist if we don't sort ourselves around. It felt like this kind of apocalyptic thing, and it would certainly be 10 years for them to get back into power. Starmer ended up doing it in 5. Shall we just tell people what some of the scoops are if they haven't seen them in the paper? Because it's an incredible list, and then I want to hear what your favourite ones are. Because it starts off with a scoop that's not about Keir Starmer. It's about somebody else, about Jeremy Corbyn.
Patrick, what is it? It's an extraordinary link between Dominic Cummings and Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. So Keir Starmer obviously came to prominence politically after his long career in the law as Jeremy Corbyn's Brexit spokesman, as the man who said no to every Tory Brexit deal, who moved Labour towards supporting a second referendum, and that was why he was so popular among the Labour membership. But what was he thwarting on the other side? What did the Corbynites want to do? And what we uncovered during the process of researching this book was something I don't think either of us ever expected to hear, and anyone ever expected to read, which was that Dominic Cummings, the man who got Brexit done for Boris Johnson, had been in contact with Jeremy Corbyn's team for quite an extended period of time, advising them on how to pass a Brexit deal from opposition, and in the process beat the Tories in an election and split them forever. You know, he was texting people close to Jeremy Corbyn days before he went into number 10 to work for Boris Johnson, which is something I don't think anyone had ever thought possible.
Mind-bending.
Yeah.
There's this amazing line from Cummings. He says, I mean, this is actually days before he went into number 10 to work for Boris Johnson as his principal advisor. He said, Boris is the Tories' last chance at ignoring reality. When that fails, ... kaboom. He had that as very boomerishly. That was a subject line of an email that he sent to one of our Corbynite sources.
Yeah, kaboom, because he was a sort of hand grenade. In fact, kaboom is the right word from and for Dominic Cummings, and no one expected him to be linked in the way that you did. Another scoop, of course, is that there was the lockdown breach investigation where Keir Starmer had been spotted with a beer in a long shot on a camera, hadn't he? And the police investigated. Now, not surprisingly, that must have sent a leadership shockwave. Who was vying to replace him if he had to go? Because he said he'd go, didn't he?
Yeah, and it did send a leadership shockwave. And the people who advised Keir Starmer not to say he resigned said the first thing that will happen is members of the shadow cabinet will start playing their own leadership bids. And that is indeed what happened. And you can't blame them for it. Obviously, it was contingency planning. But on one side, you had Wes Streeting, now the Health Secretary, of course, who was urged by lots of people to run and was thinking about it. But he knew at the same time that Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, would probably be thinking about it, which indeed she was. Indeed, there was already quite a high-level plot among senior Shadow Cabinet ministers, including Shabana Mahmood, who was running Labour campaigns at the time and is now the Justice Secretary, to basically stitch it up for Rachel Reeves. And Wes Streeting is there thinking, well, what do I do? You know, and so he confronts Rachel Reeves one night in the division lobby of the House of Commons. And he says, have you thought about what you're going to do? Because they're very good friends. And she said, I don't think it's going to happen. To which Wes Streeting said, words to the effect of, but have you thought about what you might do if it does happen? To which Rachel Reeves says, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But little did Wes Streeting know that already there was a big groundswell of support around Rachel Reeves, and the power brokers of the party had decided, we'll just give it to her by coronation.
Tell us about Angela Rayner and Prince Andrew.
This is an amazing story because the characters involved, the idea that they would ever collide in a moment of such high drama constitutionally, it was tantalising for us. So after Her Majesty the Queen, Elizabeth II, died, there was this question as to, now that Charles was king, who would be able to deputise for him in the event that he was otherwise engaged or indisposed with respect to official duties, things like giving assent to legislation or representing the UK overseas. And there is this list, councillors of state, and Prince Andrew was on it. And Angela Rayner, she had this, I think, 20-word plus job title after the Hartlepool by-election. One of her responsibilities was she was Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and that meant that she was responsible on Labour's side for the passage of legislation, essentially formalising various arrangements when Charles became king. Anyway, nobody asked for the legal and constitutional history. The key point is that because Andrew was on this list, Rayner said she was having none of it, and she had huge concerns about the idea of Prince Andrew deputising for Charles, and she referred to him using a phrase that I won't repeat on air, but did relate to his previous association with Jeffrey Epstein.
It's interesting there because you talk about Angela Rayner really having that gut instinct as a politician, right? And she's famous for that too, of having, you know, people who like her, they think that's because she does have a really good sense of where many people's hearts and minds are.
She's on the doors.
On the doors. That's also the reason some people don't like her, because they think that actually she's too sort of brash. What's fascinating in the book, though, and I was lucky enough to read it a while ago, is there's a complete contrast with Rayner and all sorts of other people who are, you know, political to their fingertips. They're all about the sort of beating pulse of the Labour voter or the Labour activist. The picture that you paint, with the help of people who know Keir Starmer very well, is of somebody who doesn't have that at all. And yet he's become Prime Minister. So, Patrick, how do you reflect on that? I mean, is that the impression that you got?
Yeah, definitely. And it's been a slightly surreal process because when you are in political journalism, I mean, you know this better than us. You always expect to find something, a secret plan or something you haven't been told about, or that you open the door and there the person is, with their plan on the back of the envelope. Keir Starmer, beyond wanting to be leader of the Labour Party and Labour Prime Minister, there isn't really much there behind that. I mean, he has broad sets of principles. He has values, but in terms of politics, he doesn't have an ism. He said to supporters of Jeremy Corbyn he was negotiating with after Jeremy Corbyn was suspended in 2020, they said, you're shifting to the right. He said, I don't have an ideology. There's no such thing as Starmerism, and there never will be, is what they recall him saying.
I mean, the other thing that will stand out, and this is quite difficult for you to talk about, I think, but we can talk about it, is that it looks... I would be worried if I was Keir about who'd briefed you.
Oh, you're an old cynic.
Well, the thing is, of course, that Morgan McSweeney won the fight with Sue Gray. That was a big sort of disaster zone of leadership, say allies of Keir Starmer. To have two very strong people being his chief of staff couldn't last very long. Morgan McSweeney wins. Morgan McSweeney's quoted in the book implying that basically Keir Starmer is a human resources type of manager rather than a big political leader. Well, I wouldn't be very happy if I was Keir Starmer sitting next to Morgan McSweeney every day with him having let his view be known.
I mean, there are very, very extensive briefings from people who know him well. That is true, right across the piece. And some of them are named in the book. And I'm sure there are also people you spoke to who aren't named in the book who helpfully talked to you. But I just wonder, how much stink do you think this is going to kick up?
In some ways, what we've remarked upon is what is self-evident to a lot of people.
And what I said at the beginning, also predictable, because it's a difficult job to go from opposition to government, and it puts pressure on individuals who are human beings.
Yeah, I think you can see from outer space that Starmer has zigged and zagged over the course of his leadership.
He's a pragmatist, his fans would say, and he's a sort of empty vessel, his detractors would say.
And psephologists would say, won a historic victory with more MPs than there are human beings in... We're
the only people that are MPs now. Yeah, exactly.
So, but I interrupted Laura. What the stink?
So I think that it is clear that that's been the arc of his leadership. That's been his trajectory. I think what we try to do is reveal how that happened. To what extent was it Keir Starmer's politics? To what extent did he subcontract the politics and policy to those around him, among them Morgan McSweeney? And there is this moment we reveal that over the course of 2019, he was having these Monday morning meetings at the home of fellow MP Jenny Chapman, where he was plotting his path to power very consciously, very deliberately. And in the first meeting, one attendee told us that Starmer didn't actually want to chair the meeting. He just didn't feel that was something he wanted to do. And when asked what it was that Starmer did want to talk about, this source said he was very keen to make sure that they were on top of things like campaign finance and disclosure rules. So you do get the strong impression that at times he has leaned on those around him, and how much he has been responsible for that shift, how much others have held his hand, is one of the questions in the book, which no doubt some would say it doesn't flatter him, or at least reveals a side to his politics that isn't consistent with, now after the fact, after Corbyn's suspension, he says it was all part of my plan, and I dragged this party by its lapels from A to B. And I think what we at least have sought to do in this book is show that the reality is a little more complicated.
And there's even a sort of hint that there was a group of people who were basically casting around for another leader who would be sort of non-scary, middle of the road, and he was someone who kind of fit the bill. I mean, that the impression is definitely there in the book that among some Labour factions, it almost could have been anyone.
Yeah, and Keir Starmer was the right man in the right place at the right time. And part of that, you shouldn't say it's easy to say Morgan McSweeney turned up one day in 2019 and gave him all the polling data he needed, which, had been something that had been shopped around a number of people. But also, Keir Starmer had done the things that so many people from the sort of centre of the Labour Party, the centre-left of the Labour Party, didn't do under Corbyn, which was he kept his head down, he served loyally, and he paid attention to what members wanted. And then, I think Morgan McSweeney saw that. Well, Morgan McSweeney did see that and said, well, hang on, this guy clearly gets it in the way that sort of people are saying the members are complete idiots, clearly don't get.
And also, I mean, he, as a lawyer, he did triangulate Boris Johnson's answers on Partygate. So he was a successful voice of opposition, and he also tackled anti-Semitism and sacked Jeremy Corbyn from the party, which are strong acts of leadership. So we are interested in Keir Starmer, the leader. And like Margaret Thatcher, you reveal he had voice training.
Yes, he did, from a woman called Leonie Mellinger, who's a Shakespearean actress. She's acted alongside Sir Patrick Stewart and other luminaries. One day in 2017, she got a phone call saying, would you like to come to Westminster and talk to a Labour MP called Keir Starmer? And she went in and she found out that he was having trouble with his speeches, or he didn't feel that he could connect with audiences, or he didn't like addressing crowds. So she watched him speak and she said, basically, that was rubbish. Didn't expect to be called back, but was called back, and she worked with Keir Starmer for 4 years. And what she told us is that actually he was incredibly conscientious, aware of his weaknesses, and really, really keen to improve. Now, some people will say he didn't improve that markedly. Those who work with him say public speaking comes much more naturally to him now. But she worked with him for 4 years. And I think that does give you an insight into the sort of leader Keir Starmer is, in terms of he knows what he doesn't know. And that's part of the reason he's not terribly interested in the stuff of politics, of the darker arts of politics. That's one of the things that explains his relationship with people like Morgan McSweeney as well. It's the sort of, I'm not interested in this, I'm not good at it, I don't particularly like it. You seem to be good at it, you know, you go over there and do it.
You know, when you were speaking a few moments ago about Starmer, Patrick was saying the stuff that Starmer did in order to become leader, and I almost think of it as a little bit like losing weight or giving up smoking or something. It's very easy in principle to say what you need to do in order to become Labour Party leader. You need to keep your head down. You need to not poison yourself in the minds of members who love Jeremy Corbyn. And you need to ensure that you say and do nothing that could be used against you in due course. I mean, that's very easy in principle, but the practice of doing it is what marked Starmer out. He had that discipline and he had that foresight to think, well, I need to think about what I need to get better at between now and the as yet undetermined moment when there is a contest. And this idea, as early as 2017, he was saying to somebody, you know, I need to get better at my speaking. He was saying to his advisor, Chris Ward, I need to practice Prime Minister's questions. I need to be able to respond to a budget. Most people don't do that. And we did speak to a lot of Starmer aides who said, well, everybody else was hyperventilating on Newsnight and saying far too much needlessly. And Keir Starmer had that ability to do only that which he needed to do and no more.
Yeah, and certainly those who would see themselves as in his camp or his fans or those who've helped him along the way would always say actually that he would be, you know, incredibly well prepared, always, relentless, always. There's a sort of sense, someone said to me when they were in the opposition leaders' kind of suite of rooms in Westminster in one of the Norman Shaw buildings, that like, you can't be late for a meeting with Keir Starmer. Like, nobody would have dared be late, or he might, like, not necessarily tell you off, but it would have been noticed. And I remember going in there once for a meeting and seeing in one of the rooms, there's a absolutely pristine spare white shirt hanging. And I asked somebody, I said, is that Keir? They said, oh, yeah, he's always got one, like, just in case. And I thought, what a little picture of someone who's always ready for there might be this incredible moment where you had to suddenly do something that was very important. So just in case...
Well, don't forget...
have a pristine shirt ready at all times.
Because that's how the staff in Downton Abbey get one over on the King's butler. They spill on his shirt. So the King's butler has to go, meaning the Downton Abbey butler is the one who actually does the butlering to the King. So you always a good tip to unnerve your rivals is to spill soup on the shirt. And so we go back to the big picture in saying goodbye. I mean, this news cycle has been so relentless, really, since the Brexit referendum, that we remember the shock to Labour, and our listeners who love Labour will even now be reaching for the tissues when we recall what actually happened at the 2019 general election. I talked about the historic win, the historic losses. So Labour, the people at the top of Labour have been on the most extraordinary roller coaster, haven't they, when you think about the 2019 banishment from seats that had always been red.
That's right. I mean, it's a topsy-turvy era in politics, and there are all these truisms of Westminster. You know, you can't do this in one term. Maybe you can. I mean, Keir Starmer shows you can, and that is why, by the way, for all of his shortcomings or for all his disinterest in politics, which naturally we are utterly obsessed by. He'll be prime minister as long as he wants, because he's the man that did the thing that so many of his predecessors couldn't.
And he might get better at it. Sorry, Laura.
Well, that's what I say. So what does it take from you guys who've immersed yourselves in talking to people about Keir Starmer for, I don't know, how long did it take you to research the book? A year, 9 months, 6 months?
A year.
A year, right. So you spent a year talking to people who know him really well. If there was one thing from each of you that you would take away from it that applies now to how he's governing, what would it be? Because someone was saying to me the other day, look, he was always underestimated. People said he couldn't turn the party around as quickly as he did. Look at what he achieved. Now the sort of view is, oh, well, the beginning of government's been a real disaster and there's no way they're ever going to be able to recreate any sense of popularity or turn the economy around. But if there's one thing from both of you that you learned that you think applies to where they are now, what would it be, Patrick?
Once he's made a decision, that process takes him a long time. It can infuriate people around him. He can be the last person to acknowledge something that's happening aloud. See Sue Gray, by the way.
Yeah.
But once he's taken that decision, he, to coin a phrase, prosecutes that case incredibly hard. So if he can find a politics, or someone can convince him of a politics that he thinks suits the moment, he will go for it like the clappers. But the problem is finding that. And like Tony Blair will wake up every morning and know exactly what to do and what his politics were. Keir Starmer doesn't have that. And that's why we're in this sort of position where 6 months in, Labour are still trying different strategies on and trying to work out what they want. But once Keir Starmer's decided, he'll go for it.
Gabriel, what would yours be?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of, just to reflect on that a little, there's this phrase that we attribute to McSweeney in a book, this idea that Starmer acts like a HR manager and not a leader. But then we also quote him saying that Starmer is a fast learner, and that in 2021 McSweeney said of him that he's enlarging as a politician. And I do think, I don't know if it's the Nike tick or a J curve, but he's stared defeat in the face more than once. He was reconciled to quitting in May 2021, and he is definitely an unusual politician in that, unlike Corbyn, whose detractor said, "You've thought the same thing for 40 years."
Yes.
That was a criticism.
A compliment and a criticism.
You never change your mind.
Yeah.
You've been saying the same thing since you were a trade union organizer in Hornsey in the 80s. Well, Starmer is a quite rare thing, and we're not here to say whether this is for better or worse, but he changes and he shapeshifts, and that makes him quite a tantalising and complex journalistic subject.
Well, congratulations. And thank you very much for filling our airwaves with all this raw research and work which you brought into Get In, which is serialised in the Sunday Times and probably the Times as well.
And it will be very interesting to see how much mischief you can make with it at Westminster this week, or indeed how much mischief rival politicians are going to enjoy, courtesy of some of the information that you guys have put out into the public domain. But thanks so much for coming in and talking to us and our newscasters this Sunday. Thank you. So, from delving into a political thriller from real life, we go to a very newsy day. Actually, there's been lots and lots of news around, so we'll just have a quick... Should we have a quick bounce around? What else has been making the news?
Yes, so Canada, Mexico and China are retaliating to Donald Trump's tariffs.
Correct. So Trump, having threatened it during the election campaign, does now seem to be holding good to the promise to slap tariffs on countries that he's not happy with. They're due to come into force on Tuesday. 25% on Canadian and Mexican imports, 10% tax on Chinese goods, and Canadian energy having a tax of 10%. And Canada and Mexico have said that they will retaliate by putting their own taxes on American goods. So it is all hotting up. Maybe the sort of first moves in what people have worried about, a trade war on its way under the Trump White House.
So you had a senior member of the cabinet on the sofa, Yvette Cooper, and there's been this sort of choice presented by the Commentariat that the British could somehow choose between the EU and the US. And when asked about it, I think Keir Starmer said that he doesn't feel that he has to choose. But inevitably, that's out there for the Commentariat.
That's right. And the Conservative Shadow Business Secretary was with us this morning, said you couldn't... I'm not sure if I want to say this again. I had to say it on the television this morning. He said trying to make love to the US, who's a rhino, and the EU, who's a sloth, at the same time.
Was that the metaphor?
That was the metaphor he chose. Anyway, the point is, how does the UK, sitting in the middle, operate and do business with an increasingly sort of gung-ho, deregulating America under Donald Trump, and an EU that moves more slowly, is just bringing in all sorts of new rules and regulations on digital markets, for example. So how on earth do we sit in between those two things? And we asked Yvette Cooper this morning what the threat is, and could the UK avoid being caught up in a trade war?
Well, tariff increases really right across the world can have a really damaging impact on global growth and trade. So I don't think it's what anybody wants to see. But the focus for Johnny Reynolds, our Business and Trade Secretary, is on building trade links and better trading relationships and removing barriers to trade with the US and also with other European countries and with countries right across the world. We want to reduce the barriers to trade, make it easier for businesses.
The UK does feel a bit like a bystander.
Historically, that is a very powerful role, to be between the US and Europe. And of course, entering the EEC in the 70s was part of a giant adjustment of what we were going to do with our historic role. So, of course, if Keir Starmer wanted to, he could present it as we have the best of both worlds, actually. But inevitably, he's going to be triangulated because quite a lot of businesses have written to warning that the EU regulations at the moment are coming so thick and fast that even they've said they might have to delay some of the accounting rules because business is being offered this sort of bonfire of regulation over on the other side of the Atlantic. And we are at the end. So we say thank you very much and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.